It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the first of this year's Frankie lectures. The Frankie seminars and the associated lectures are a very, very interesting program here at the Whitney that was funded in 2004 by Rich and Barbara Frankie. Rich and Barbara are often at the lectures today. They're in Chicago and cannot be there, unfortunately. The funding enables a professor or team of professors to teach a seminar, first of all. That doesn't enable that, but it enables them on top of that seminar to curate and coordinate a small lecture series. Perhaps sometimes there have been films and screenings, or there have been other things as well, but usually it is a small lecture series and a distinguished lecture series whereby fantastic people from outside Yale are brought in to speak on the topic or around the topic of the seminar. It's a great program. There is a parallel program called the Schulman Seminar, which is specifically, while the Frankie seminars are in the humanities, the Schulman seminars are at the border of humanities and science. These two have the same lecture series associated with them. I've taught a Schulman seminar, and it's a wonderful experience because it brings the external scholars into conjunction with the undergraduates in the seminar in a close way, over dinner in a seminar, and then also gives us an opportunity for a public lecture from our visitors. I'm not going to introduce the visitor yet because I'm going to wait for Martin Hegland, who is this year's convener of the Frankie seminar this year, the topic being in time, and I will let Martin introduce our speaker in just a moment. I just wanted to go down just very quickly a few of the topics that we've had in recent years. Nietzsche and Emerson was organized by Paul North and Paul Grimstad in 2013. Utopia by John Rogers in 2014. Interpreting Film Masterpieces by Dudley Andrew, whom I think I saw. Dudley? Yeah. There you are. Yeah, Dudley Andrew and David Bromwich, 2015. James Baldwin's American Scene, Jackie Goldsby in 2016. This was an extraordinary one. New Orleans in the American Imaginary last year. Joseph Fischel and Crystal Femster. It's an eclectic group of seminars. They can go in all kinds of different directions, but they are fantastic experiences, we think, for the public that comes to the lectures, for the undergraduates that take the seminar as well. I hope you all agree. Thank you, Martin, please.
Thank you, Gary, for that, and also for leading the Whitney Humanities Center, which this is a part. I am really delighted to welcome Taylor Carman to us from Columbia. We've already had a very lively seminar. One of the great features of the Frankie, as Gary briefly mentioned, is that not only do these people come and give a talk, they actually come and participate in the seminar. And today, without getting into any details, it was very lively and productive, even when there were serious disagreements. So it's already been a very intense day, and I'm excited to continue with the talk. So Taylor Carman is professor of philosophy at Barnard College in Columbia University, and he's the author of two important books of philosophy, Heidegger's Analytic from 2003 and Merleau-Ponty from 2008. That is also forthcoming in the second edition shortly, I think. And he's also edited the Cambridge Companion to Merleau-Ponty and published a number of important articles on Heidegger, phenomenology, continental philosophy, the intersection between continental and analytic philosophy. On our syllabus, we have no less than 2 chapters from Taylor's book assigned and several of his articles. And there are many good reasons for that. And let me say a few things just about, first of all, his book on Heidegger from 2003, Heidegger's Analytic, that has the remarkable feature of being both one of the best introductions to being in time you can read, and also one of the most advanced books on being in time you can read. And that's a very rare feat to do those things at once. I'm always very comfortable recommending it both to students who are starting out reading Being in Time and those who have come very far and want to really deepen their understanding of the thorniest issues in the book. So, and the same is true of Taylor's articles on Heidegger too. I read recently that Heidegger, apart from Aristotle, there's no philosopher who is as much has been written on as Heidegger. But despite that quantity, there's a very select group of scholars who are actually able to both translate the stakes of what Heidegger is doing in his very difficult language into general philosophical concerns, and also make explicit for us that despite that the text is so difficult, it has direct purchase on how we lead our lives. And Taylor is one of the few people who can really do both of those things. He has an amazing ability to combine phenomenological description with conceptual analysis. And that's also why he's been such an important voice in the dialogue between continental and analytic approaches to Heidegger. And it's also one of the reasons that the few times we're lucky that Taylor ventures out and also starts talking about art or literature, he's also extremely sensitive with regard to these things. And I think we'll see some of that today as he's taking on both the big conceptual question of what Heidegger means by truth, but also how that can be brought to bear on questions of narrative truth, perhaps a few words about pictorial truth, and perhaps most suggestively, truth as fidelity. So I'm super excited to have Taylor here, and please join me in welcoming.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak with you and to you about Heidegger and being in time and related issues, and for the very lively seminar we had earlier. I'm still sort of catching my breath. Thank you for the invitation. The Humanities Center is very, as I say, honored and happy to be here. I'm going to be talking about truth, and I have several different purposes that have all sort of converged. So I hope the result is clear. I want to talk about truth with respect to what Heidegger has to say about truth, but then I want to extend Heidegger's idea a bit in a direction that he didn't, that I think he should have and could have. But I also want to talk about narrative and truth in narrative, and specifically how we ought to understand truth in narrative so as to possibly resolve some debates about whether and to what extent narratives or stories can be true of human lives. Those are my purposes. My main purpose is to say that if we extend Heidegger's concept of truth in the right way, we can understand what's really at stake in trying to tell a true story of somebody's life in, say, a biography. The title I gave you some months ago was Pictorial and Narrative Truth, and I'm going to have a lot less to say about pictures today, because as I've been thinking about this over the last few months, I've just gotten more interested in questions about narrative. But on your handout at the bottom, I did include a picture which I was going to talk about, which is Françoise Gillot and Picasso's portrait of her. She was his, not wife, but girlfriend and the mother of two of his children, and she wrote this fascinating memoir called My Life with Picasso. She talks about this picture that he painted of her, and I'm going to say a little bit about how and in what ways it's true. It's obviously false because she was not a plant or a flower, but it's true in another way. But I'm going to really be talking more about narrative. But I'll start with truth and with Heidegger. So Heidegger famously draws a distinction between two concepts of truth, and those are the two you see more or less in the left and right-hand columns in the upper part of the big box there, underneath the big Greek word aletheia, which is the Greek word for truth. And it's the Greek word that Heidegger picks on in order to, as it were, promote his own idea of truth in the left-hand column there as unconcealment. But he distinguishes famously between these two concepts of truth. The first is the traditional notion of rightness or correctness, Richtigkeit in German, which is the simple common sense concepts taken for granted by, but not identical with its philosophically theorized offspring, the agreement or correspondence conception, and that in German is Übereinstimmung. I distinguish those as isn't often done in the secondary literature, but Heidegger does sometimes. In his better moments, he often refers to the correspondence conception or the correspondence theory. This is what philosophers have been talking about for a long time, the correspondence theory of truth. It's really not mostly what Heidegger's interested in. The correspondence idea of truth, a belief or a proposition corresponding to what it's true of, is a philosopher's invention. It's a philosopher's theory. It goes back as far as Aristotle. I don't think it goes back any further. I don't think there's any evidence of it before Aristotle. You can press me on that if you want to, Plato says things that sound like it, but really they sound as much like what's called the redundance theory. To say what's true is to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, and to say what's false is to say of what is that it isn't, and so on. And those tautologies, Plato says that. That doesn't sound like correspondence to me as much as a kind of redundancy theory, but that is a theory of truth understood as correctness. And that's not homoiosis, but there in the top box, orthotes, which means correctness. Heidegger's word again is Richtigkeit, and as I'll say in a minute, one can in some contexts translate Richtigkeit into English as accuracy, and I think that's what Heidegger has in mind. The ordinary notion is truth as accuracy. That's the first concept. That's the traditional concept, not so much the theorization of that concept in the idea of correspondence, but you already find the conception of correctness in Plato. For example, in the Theaetetus, Plato, when he talks about false judgment, he says false judgment is like an archer missing the mark. And there the metaphor is you've either hit the mark or you've missed the mark. Notice there's no talk of mirroring or correspondence or agreement. An arrow doesn't agree with the target, it just hits it, or it doesn't. That's the primitive notion. That's really what Heidegger is mostly interested in sort of the history of thought. So I think the correspondence conception is a bit of a red herring, but as we'll see, it can interfere with our idea of what it is for a story to be true of a life. So something like the correspondence theory, as I said, can be found in Aristotle, but the simple notion of correctness is explicit already in Plato. And though Heidegger was in fact slow to admit this, it can also be found not theoretically or explicitly so much, but just in the use of the Greek word aletheia in the Iliad. So at one point Heidegger thought that Plato had invented this notion, but it's, as others have pointed out, it's in ordinary Greek going back to Homer. The second concept, Heidegger's own concept, is what he variously calls disclosedness, Zerschlossenheit, or unhiddenness or unconcealment. Unverborgenheit is the German term. This concept is very different from correctness. For one thing, its opposite is not falsity, but obscurity, concealment, oblivion. This means that even when things are showing up in wrong, distorted, or misleading ways, they're still true in Heidegger's sense of the word. My memories may be incorrect or inaccurate, but as long as they are memories and not wishes or fantasies, my mere having of them discloses my past to me as that about which my particular memories might be true in the ordinary sense of the word, or false. So my memory is disclosive of the past, and there's a truth in that, so Heidegger says. Another mark of the distinctiveness of the concept of unconcealment is that, like illumination, it comes in degrees, whereas at least traditionally truth and falsity are polarized or bimodal. The middle is excluded, famously, if you've ever heard of the law of excluded middle. There's no excluded middle in concealment and unconcealment. There's almost always only middle, in fact, come to think of it. Heidegger's central thesis about these two concepts of truth is that the first presupposes the second. Correctness is intelligible, and so even possible, only against the background or on condition of unconcealment. What makes unconcealment worthy of the name truth, though? That's the question. It's a question that his student Ernst Tugendhat pressed. Is unconcealment really a kind of truth? Or is it merely one of its, presumably many, conditions of intelligibility? Heidegger equivocated about this for years, from his early formulations of the distinction in the 1920s, and most famously in section 44 of Being and Time, to finally the 1964 seminar, the title of which is The End of Philosophy, in which he finally conceded that it was, as he says, inadequate and misleading to call unconcealment truth, as he had been doing for the last 40 years or so. So by 1964, he just says, okay, don't call it truth. Well, that's giving up. Well, is it giving up a lot? That's the question. Faced with this apparent disavowal, we have several options. The first, at one extreme, is to cling to what I think is the least plausible interpretation of Heidegger's position, namely that he wanted to destroy the concept of correctness and replace it with his own notion of truth as unconcealment, and just do away with the notion of correctness and only talk of unconcealment. I don't see how he could possibly have thought anything like this. John Sallis, for one, has proposed that since things can, indeed must, be only partly unconcealed, concealed and unconcealed at once, Heidegger must therefore be denying the law of non-contradiction. A lot of people seem to think Heidegger denied the law of non-contradiction, but I don't think he did. That's at one extreme, but I don't think that's what Heidegger had in mind. Another extreme, the other extreme, Mark Rathall, who's a great commentator on Heidegger, has argued that the apparent recanting in the 1964 seminar was really just a matter of terminological housekeeping, and that by calling unconcealment truth, as he had previously done, Heidegger never meant to say more than that it is the ontological condition of the possibility of correctness. You just got to have unconcealment to have correctness. For sentences, propositions, beliefs to be true or false, something must first of all be showing up. Now, the problem with this approach, I don't have a knockdown argument about this reading of Heidegger, but it is disappointingly innocuous. It's not, strictly speaking, trivial, but it conveys none of the excitement promised by Heidegger's original claim that there's more to truth itself, than either the metaphysical tradition or contemporary common sense had hitherto imagined. The second problem is that Being and Time is replete with concepts that could equally claim to describe existential conditions of correctness. He talks about being in, worldliness, the worldliness of the world, understanding, discourse, interpretation. There's all kinds of things that are conditions of the correctness of a proposition or belief with respect to what it's about. And even disclosedness, which in section 44 of Being and Time he says is really, that's Dasein's disclosedness, is the kind of truth that he's really interested in. Even that term was already doing other systematic work in the text prior to its appearance in section 44 as specifying this new ontological notion of truth. So Tugendhat's question is a good one. Why call this truth? Right? So in this paper I want to try to vindicate, in a way that I think Heidegger himself never fully managed to do, his, you might say, promiscuous, maybe even perverse use of the word truth to mean unconcealment as well as correctness. The two notions are distinct, I shall argue, but deeply interconnected. However we actually decide to use the word, simply clinging to tradition by denying its application to unconcealment, which is what you run up against mostly when you talk to philosophers about this. They just say, that's very interesting, but it's not truth. Right? Giving up the idea that there's a sense of truth which is something like unconcealment carries a cost, and moreover, I think does violence even to our common sense understanding of truth in non-discursive contexts, for example, in narrative and pictorial forms. Stories and pictures, that is, especially portraits and biographies, have a way of getting it right about their subjects, not by representing them in factually accurate ways, but by being true to them, to the subjects, revealing them as they are, by being faithful to them. And this is what I mean by truth as fidelity. A biography, a picture, a portrait can be true to the subject. It's a kind of faithfulness, but it's also a way of getting it right, and it reveals the person. So I think these are cases in which it seems to me the traditional concept and Heidegger's concept really overlap or converge, and that we need both to make sense of a kind of non-factual truth. It's a kind of rightness that is not the sort of correctness which is accuracy. And Heidegger never made this distinction, maybe partly for linguistic reasons, but I think mostly that he was just interested in drawing this distinction. He wasn't so much interested, or just didn't manage to justify putting them somehow together under the same word, aletheia. So notice that I said stories and pictures can be true by getting things right in a distinctive, non-factual way. Well, but isn't rightness just precisely Richtigkeit? I mean, it's a translation of Richtigkeit, which is Heidegger's word for correctness. And here I want to exploit the lexical resources of English, which is conveniently, for me, a hybrid of Latin and Germanic vocabularies. Right is Germanic. Correct comes from the Latin correctus. Now, J.L. Austin, at least according to John Searle, I don't know if he ever says this anywhere in print, but I heard John Searle say, Austin said, there are no perfect synonyms. I might as well add, when I heard Searle say this, Searle said, but there's one exception, and it is, and I can't remember what he said. And I've emailed him several times saying, do you remember when you said there was one exception? There's two words that are perfectly synonymous in English, and I haven't heard back from him. This may disappear in the oral history of this part of philosophy, but oh well. I'm just going to stick with there are no perfect synonyms. So I think this is a case in point. In some contexts, as I said earlier, one can translate the German richtig as accurate. I mean, one can translate accurate in other ways too, genau, exact, and so on. But obviously not everything that can be said to be right can be said to be accurate. It was right of me to apologize, but my apologizing was neither accurate nor inaccurate. So right is just a much broader term than accurate. I think right, to my ear, sounds broader than correct, even though they should be synonyms. I mean, you can say that my apologizing was correct. That's a little bit more ordinary English. It sounds like I'm doing ordinary language philosophy here, and I don't really mean to be, but it's just kind of illustration, and I'm not resting my case so much on how the words fall out. So one could say that my apologizing was correct, and in German, actions as well as propositions can be either richtig or falsch. Falsch in German can be translated into wrong, right? In English, it's not impossible to call an action false. It's not very usual, but one can say, as in one false move, and, that's false. But the standard term would be wrong. An action would be wrong rather than right. But wrong, now being, though a Germanic word, strangely there's no cognate in modern German as there is in Dutch and the Scandinavian languages, all of which is to say that although it's possible that Heidegger included practical and moral rightness under his general concept of Richtigkeit, he seems to have had more interest in factual rightness than in the rightness or wrongness of conduct or character. And my point here is just that he draws a pretty sharp distinction between correctness, Richtigkeit, maybe even sense of accuracy, and on the other hand, unconcealment. And I'm trying to say there's another category, there's extra room under the category of rightness that allows us to bring in something like unconcealment or revealing. Okay, but I don't find this third concept, and this is what I'm introducing in the lower box here, the non-factual kind of rightness that we can find, say, in pictures or stories. It's a kind of Richtigkeit, but it's not what Heidegger seems mostly to have had in mind when he talks about Richtigkeit, namely correctness or accuracy. I'm thinking of it as a kind of faithfulness or fidelity or being true to, so one could say loyalty, Treue, which is of course etymologically linked to true. But I don't find this concept, at least I don't know of it occurring in Heidegger, but I think it promises to bring together these other two concepts that Heidegger does talk about. Truth as fidelity, being true to the matter at hand, reveals it, does it justice, shows it to be what, or in the case I'm interested in, who, or somebody is. There's a way of getting it right that is precisely a kind of revealing or showing of them. Okay, so what is it to get it right about who somebody is? I want to quote somebody quoting somebody. I'm quoting Raymond Goethe, who I'm going to discuss in just a minute, who quotes Isaac Denison, Karen Blixen, saying, "You ask who he was? Let me answer in the time-honored fashion and tell you a story." So telling a story is a way of saying who somebody is. And here I refer you to the next section of my handout. I just want to distinguish three things we can have in mind when we say, I know who someone is. The first two are relatively trivial because I'm interested in the third, but just to put our ducks in order, what is it to know who somebody is? In the first case, it's knowledge by description. For example, knowing that Homer was the author of the Iliad. That may be the only thing we know about Homer. I mean, there's a joke that says if the Iliad wasn't written by Homer, it was written by a blind Greek poet of the same name, right? But I want to include in number one, pointing to somebody and say, oh, I know who that is, I know, or a name, I know that so-and-so is the author of such and such. Description knowledge. Number two is knowledge by acquaintance, but I don't mean what Bertrand Russell meant by that quite. I think it's fine. In fact, I'm committed to a distinction between knowledge by description and knowledge by acquaintance. Bertrand Russell was thinking of sense data, that you know them by having them. The mistake he was making was with the objects he was picking out. I don't think we have knowledge by acquaintance of those kinds of things, but I do think we have acquaintance knowledge, which is not knowledge by description. So what I have in mind is knowing somebody by acquaintance, being acquainted with the person, which in ordinary common sense just means having met them. If you say, do you know somebody, you would say, well, I've met them, right? This is more than just having a description. And there's a big transition from just reading about somebody to meeting them. When you meet them, suddenly you have a whole different relation to them just by being in their presence, hearing them speak, watching how they move, and so on. This is an important distinction, I think. There's a big transition that happens between just reading about somebody, thinking about if you could meet Socrates. It would be a big difference between just reading about Socrates. So there's a big difference between knowledge by description and knowledge by real acquaintance, not Bertrand Russell kind of acquaintance, but actually meeting somebody. That's fine. But I think there's also a very important distinction between that and what I want to call intimate personal knowledge, which is not just having met somebody, but actually knowing somebody. What do you know when you know somebody? This is what you know when you've gotten to know them. And this is also why, interestingly, when somebody says, do you know someone, you say, well, I've met them, but I don't really know them, right? I mean, there's a big difference. Now, not that there's a split second where you transition from having met them to knowing them. How many times do you have to speak to them before you know them? But it's not that there's a sharp cutoff, but there's an important conceptual difference. There's a point at which you feel that you can say, I know this person, right? You've talked to them enough, you get to know them, there's something you know that you didn't know before. Okay, so that's the kind of personal but intimate personal knowledge that I'm interested in and that I think narrative, but also pictures, have possibly something important to teach us about. Maybe I'll come back to Françoise Gillot at the end. But let me talk about narrative a little bit. Okay. Some historians and philosophers are attracted to the idea, and have been for a long time, that our understanding of human life must necessarily be a narrative kind of understanding. So there's a debate that's been going on for, I don't know the history of this debate, but some decades, about narrative vis-a-vis lives and identities, characters, what you know when you know who someone is. By the way, let me just say as a footnote, those of you in the Heidegger seminar can connect a lot of what I'm saying to Heidegger's categories. When Heidegger talks about Dasein, he talks about the who of Dasein, right? And this is partly what I'm addressing. Who is somebody? It's a fundamental category of our understanding of human beings, that we understand ourselves, as who rather than what. That's a deep ontological difference, and partly what I'm interested in exploring here. So some historians and philosophers are attracted to the idea that our understanding of human life, of the who of Dasein, you might say, must necessarily be a narrative kind of understanding. Some go so far as to say that human life, that is life in its distinctively human form, I'm not talking about animal life, but human lives in the biographical sense of the word, has an essentially narrative structure, that lives just are structured. Alexander Nahamas's wonderful book on Nietzsche is subtitled Life as Literature. I think he's committed to a kind of narrativist view of human lives. Alistair MacIntyre, in After Virtue, another great book, writes, narrative history of a certain kind turns out to be the basic and essential genre for the characterization of human actions. And he's building on Elizabeth Anscombe's account of the intentionality of action, according to which action is distinguished from a broader range of behaviors or doings by being done under some particular description, not just anything that might be truly said of it, but what captures its proper aim and relevant context of performance. Not everything I do is an action of mine. So although I am exerting force on the floor with the weight of my body and making noises, what I'm doing in the proper action sense of the word is giving a lecture. MacIntyre's pithy statement of the narrativist thesis is that, as he puts it, stories are lived before they're told. Barbara Hardy went further when she wrote, and this is really Richard Moran quoting Alistair MacIntyre quoting Barbara Hardy, Barbara Hardy says, we dream in narrative, daydream in narrative, remember, anticipate, hope, despair, believe, doubt, plan, revise, criticize, construct, gossip, learn, hate, and love by narrative. Now, these claims, both Hardy's and McIntyre's, seem to me vastly overstated. And in what follows, I want to defend a modified view of the modified version of the opposite view, call it the anti-narrativist view, which has recently been interestingly criticized by Richard Moran in his 2015 Aquinas lecture entitled The Story of My Life. It's in his recent collection of essays called The Philosophical Imagination. Moran finds the anti-narrativist view articulated by fictional characters such as Dostoevsky's Underground Man, who's a complicated case because it's very hard to sort out whether what the Underground Man says is Dostoevsky's view about anything or whether it's just symptomatic of a kind of pathology. But Dostoevsky's Underground Man is hostile to the very idea that any description of him could be true, let alone a story. I'm going to leave the Underground Man alone just for now, but another good example is Roquentin, the hero of Sartre's novel Nausea. Roquentin presents a clearer case for what he says, bravely but with no small dose of melancholy, is that life is not made up of what he calls adventures or stories, at least not for the person actually living the life. Unfortunately, as Moran rightly says, this leads him to the more skeptical thesis that no story can really be true. Life doesn't have the structure of a story, so stories always get it wrong. Narratives inevitably distort and indeed falsify the lives they purport to describe. Another source in this debate is Hayden White's classic The Fiction of Narrative, which defends a similar anti-narrativist view, at least the idea that narratives are always fictions, never get it really right. Now, Richard Moran argues that these skeptics go wrong, as skeptics often do, by taking for granted an inappropriate standard of truth or success. And so it's something like a correspondence theory, right? To be true, lives would have to have the structure of stories, and they don't, so stories are always false. That's simplifying, but that's the gist of the view, and I think Moran is right to criticize this. If stories always or inevitably get it wrong about the course and structure of human life, what criterion of rightness are they failing to satisfy? Such skeptics, Moran says, when they talk about the diversity, the difference of perspectives, that is, the perspective of the narrator and the perspective of the liver of the life, right? From my point of view, my life doesn't have the structure that the narrator of the story of my life has. I'll refer you to another memorable line from Kierkegaard, which once I saw it, I see it everywhere. Everybody likes to quote this, and it's a wonderful little remark. Kierkegaard says, life can only be understood backwards, but it has to be lived forwards, right? So if you replace understood with narrated, I think he's exactly right. There's a retrospective structure of narrative different from the futural perspective you have as a real person that is that difference in perspective is important. Now, Moran says the skeptics, the anti-narrativists, are correct in insisting on this difference of perspective. But they're wrong to interpret that as meaning that the retrospective or external perspective, that's the perspective of the narrator, must be false to the reality in question. And I think he's right about this. That difference of perspective doesn't mean that all stories are doomed to be false. According to Moran, it's not narrative as such, but particular narratives that fail to tell the whole story or an adequate story of a person's life. Narrative does not fall short of the real, non-narrative structure of human temporality, he argues. That's to say, the skeptics think life has a non-narrative structure, and so narratives always get it wrong. But I think he's right to say this seems to suppose that narratives could only be true by having the same structure as the lives, right? By mapping onto them or mirroring them somehow. But his suggestion is that you shouldn't think that it's narrative as such that fails to capture the, as it were, story of people's lives. It's simply the finitude of particular narrative perspectives that falls short of the multiplicity of perspectives that in fact makes up the dramatic complexity of human life. And he concludes his essay by considering an example, the example of Oedipus. you all know the story of Oedipus. He doesn't know what's going on in his life until the very end. Jocasta knows before he does, and we, the audience, know way before he does. And the difference of perspective is what makes it look like, as a liver of a life, the story that someone else might know about your life is not available to you. So what Moran says is this whole complex that makes up the story of Oedipus, the whole story, is not lived out by any character in the play, and couldn't be. The only perspective that could encompass them all is that of the audience, who's outside those events, and not just spatially and temporally, but metaphysically. Interesting, right? You have to be metaphysically outside those events to really see, as it were, the whole story. What you'd have to be, he says, is not a character at all, and play no role in the events recounted. So his suggestion is that it looks like narrative is inadequate, but really what that means is that no one particular narrative is ever going to be adequate. There's always going to be a multiplicity of perspectives, and from any one perspective, another perspective leaves something out, and the perspective of the agent or the person, the subject of the story, is always going to be unavailable to the agent. Now, I think it's interestingly symptomatic that he's considering a fictional case, and a case in which there's an audience. And I want to talk about a real case of a narrative of a life. And just quickly, I will say, I think that there is a structural problem, more than just the diversity of finite narrative perspectives. The structural problem is a little bit like what Kierkegaard had in mind, and it's a problem with narrative as such. It's a problem we can only see, though, if we resist the temptation to say that narratives can be true only by corresponding to, mirroring, or matching the supposed narrative structure of human action and human life itself. I think there's a reason to say that human life has an importantly non-narrative structure, and that's why no narrative can capture it, though of course stories can be true. So I want to say precisely by seeing what this distinctive kind of narrative truth is, what it is for a story to be true, namely fidelity to its subject, only by seeing that can we see what is necessarily non-narrative in life itself. So if we really understand what it is for a story to be true, that is not by matching the supposed intrinsic narrative structure of a life, only then can we appreciate how life fails to be narrative. That's my promise to you. I'll flesh it out now as we go. So, as I said, I think it's interestingly strange that Moran ends by saying the audience could see the whole picture. Maybe God can see the whole picture, but it's not available to us. What about a real case? The remark of Karen Blixen's when she said, "You asked me who he was, let me answer in the time-honored fashion and tell you a story," is quoted by Raymond Gaeta, who is an Australian philosopher who wrote a memoir about his childhood and his parents. He quotes this remark in an essay, a philosophical essay, reflecting on his memoir, which is called Romulus My Father. And that really was his father's name. It wasn't a dramatic title. He didn't know what to call the book, and his father's name is Romulus. And somebody said, why not call it Romulus My Father? What a great title, right? Stumbling upon a fantastic title. But that was his name. His father was Romanian, from a Romanian-speaking part of, somewhere in Yugoslavia, I think. Should have looked it up. That's right, right. Because I'm really feeling it. That's what matters. Yeah, exactly. So Romulus is not such a strange name in Romanian-speaking cultures, perhaps. The book is a stark, deeply affecting account of Raymond Gaeta's parents' troubled life together, his mother's insanity and suicide, but above all, the person, the life history, the talents, the strengths and the weaknesses, in short, the character of his father. The affective power of the story, as Gaeta himself observes, he says at least he hopes, comes from the truthfulness, the seriousness, the integrity of the narrative. It matters that he neither buries unpleasant episodes nor fictionalizes details for dramatic or sentimental effect. He says he's really trying to get it right. But it's not accuracy as such that establishes the book's moral and emotional integrity. Perhaps more important than the facts themselves, Goethe suggests, is the tone of seriousness that he brought to the telling of the tale, the attitude of respect, indeed love, for the characters he describes in all their frailty, their humble virtues, the tragic arc of their lives. The truthfulness he sought in writing the book was as much a matter of mood and style as of factual correctness. And again, those of you who are reading Being and Time, you think of Befindlichkeit, or attunement or mood, which Heidegger had earlier associated with Aristotle's rhetoric, setting a tone, a mood, very important. And this is what Goethe says he was specially trying to do to get it right about the story of his father, to show you who his father was. To resort to cliché or to indulge in sentiment, for example, he says, would have been a kind of failure, in fact, a kind of falsity, a betrayal of his responsibility to bear witness to the lives of his parents with the full seriousness that they deserved. In resisting pathos, Goethe says, and I'm quoting him, I was not trying to get the feeling out of the writing. I was trying to make the feeling true. So false sentiment, sentimentality, it would be false feeling. It would get the story false. So he has a nice discussion of the difference between how sentimentality can interfere with scientific research. If somebody's sentimental, it may lead them to overestimate the intelligence of animals, and they're getting it wrong because the sentimentality of their attitude towards animals is causing them to get it wrong about the facts. Whereas somebody who buries their dog in a fancy cemetery with a tomb and has a sentimental view that this is how a dog should be treated, you might say, you don't have to, bracket whether you agree or not, this might be a kind of sentimentality which is not causing a kind of false attitude, but is a false attitude to the dog. The sentimentality is getting it wrong itself about dogs and their relation to us. Just suppose you agree with the judgment. You can flesh out the details of the case to make it unpalatable enough that you agree that this is sentimentality to the point of falsity, rather than sentimentality which has diverted your judgment from getting the facts right in a scientific inquiry. So it's vital that we hear Goethe's use of the word true. When he says, I was trying to make the feeling true, he's using the word true in a way I think that combines three distinct but interconnected senses. Genuine or real, like true as opposed to, what are some good examples of true grit, right? Is real grit. And true, real teeth as opposed to false teeth. False teeth are not real teeth. That's genuine, but faithful, that's the sense that I'm most interested in. True to the subject, but also right. And that's Richtigkeit in its broader sense than Heidegger, I think, had explicitly in view. Goethe's aim was to be true to his father, not in the sense of honoring him or defending his reputation, but by respectfully, and I think it's important to say lovingly, getting it right about who he was. To tell a story that would show who he was, which is what he wanted to do, however, he would have to go beyond what fact and reason could determine. For example, so here are open-ended questions which fact and reason can't decide. Was in paying the rent for his estranged wife and her lover and their baby, was his father proving himself to be a generous soul or a pathetic cuckold? You can tell the story either way, and it's interestingly underdetermined by the facts. Goethe's reflection on his memoir make clear, I think, what ought to be evident in any case. And he doesn't say this, but I'm saying it on his behalf. No one other than Raymond Goethe could have written this book, Romulus My Father, and not just because of the title, but because it's his testament to his father. No one else was in a position to say just what Goethe had to say about who his father was. Moreover, the rightness of Goethe's testament doesn't necessarily entail the wrongness of a conflicting account, even one that might seem to contradict it, for example, in its assessment of his father's character. Now, I'm not going so far as to say that two stories that actually do logically contradict each other can both be true, but I think you can get very close to something that looks like a contradiction, that at least is a conflict that forces you to choose one story or the other, but they can both claim to be true. So it's a little bit like incommensurability of paradigms in Thomas Kuhn's account of science. They can be genuinely in conflict, not so that you can show that they are logically contradictory, but in such a way that you can't just easily put them together with a conjunction and say it's one big story. You can't put these stories together. You're either going to tell a story that he was a pathetic cuckold, or you can tell the story that he had this extraordinary generosity. But you can't really tell, I'm supposing, you can't really tell both stories and make it a single coherent story. The kind of truth that Goethe was aspiring to is not factual accuracy, but it has its own kind of what he calls objectivity. And I would hesitate to use this word, but he uses it. And by that he means, he says nothing fancy, philosophically fancy, but as he says, quote, seeing things as they really are. Or better, as he says he was doing, quote, trying to see things as they were rather than as they were constantly appearing to me. I did not want to deceive myself. So what he's trying to be is honest, but also true to his father, recognizing his father's strengths and weaknesses, not, as I said, papering over difficult issues, but also being genuinely faithful as a witness to the life of his father so that he could show you who he was. That's my concrete case. Now, what do I want to say about that? What's important about that is precisely what I think distinguishes my third level of knowing who someone is from the second level. That is, and I didn't say this before, but when you get to know somebody and you know who they are, they're no longer, as it were, a third person, but a second person. I mean, what's the condition of your saying that you actually know somebody rather than that you've just met them? It's that you've actually talked to them, and they've talked to you, and you have a second person relation to them. And in that, having that second person relation to them, you share enough of their view of the world, how they see themselves and how they relate to their future, that you share with them the relation to the future that cannot be captured in a neat story. Now let me finish just by saying a little bit more. I didn't say this before, I guess I should have. This debate about the possibility of narratives being true of lives, a lot of it hinges on what you think counts as a narrative. So the people who defend the narrativist view, it often turns out they'll accept almost anything as a description of a person, a series of events, as being a narrative. And so if you make the concept of narrative capacious enough, it'll almost be trivially true that when we understand each other under the aspect of narrative. But I think the claim is only interesting if we distinguish narratives or stories from some other kinds of descriptions. The description that Hayden White distinguishes is what he calls the chronicle. A mere chronicle is just, as it were, a list of events. So every day you could fill into the log or the blog, today this happened, today this happened, today this happened. What you would have wouldn't be a story. It would be a list of events. That's not enough. I think a narrative, to be interestingly different from any other kind of description, has to have something like a turning point which forces you to see retrospectively things differently than you saw them before the turn. That's what stories usually have. Something like a turn that recasts your view of what led up to the turn. And this is a structure that can be present in very concise form in jokes. Jokes have this structure. The reason a joke works is because by the end you see the beginning differently. And jokes can be very short. So narratives don't have to be long, drawn-out affairs. So my favorite example for the moment, Henny Youngman, the master of the one-liner, had a joke, which I think has this kind of structure, this retrospective structure, in a single sentence. I don't know if any of you know the joke. It's a conditional. It begins, if I'm not in bed by 11 o'clock, does anybody know this joke? If I'm not in bed by 11 o'clock, I go home. Right? Okay, so you see the beginning differently than you saw the end. It works as a joke. I think nobody laughed, but okay. Gee, all right, I thought it was funny. Doesn't matter if you think it's funny. You see the structure, right? Even bad jokes are jokes, but sometimes they fail because they just don't even work, right? I mean, they're just not. So when somebody's bad at telling stories, you hear, then this happened, then this, and at some point you want to say, where are we going with this, right? It's a series of events. And this affects debates about history and narrative and stories, like is history one damn thing after another, or does it have this kind of narrative structure built into it? So I think for the claim about life having narrative structure, there has to be at least some content to the notion of narrative that distinguishes it from mere descriptions of a series of events. And that's just what you can only do retrospectively. But when you get to know somebody to the point that you can say who they are, you know who they are, you can say who they are in the form of a story, you are necessarily sharing enough of the view of the world with them that you share their sense of the future, which is never going to be encompassed into a story until after their life is finished and you can look back on it from a point of view which they are excluded from. So this is really the point I want to try to make. I think what's right about the anti-narrativist view is that the futural structure, and again, it's a very Heideggerian theme, but the futural structure of existence is precisely what cannot be understood in narrative form, because it's open-ended, it's uncertain. You can predict or forecast things about your future which turn out to be true, but it's almost a grotesque accident if the story you tell yourself about the future turns out to be true. Let me end with one example of this. An example I sort of want to try to generalize. You know the Scorsese movie, The King of Comedy. The character is kind of a pathetic loser. He's maybe 30. He's living in his mother's basement. He wants to be a comedian. He wants to be a talk show host. He's got this fantasy about himself. He's telling himself a story about his life, about his future. He and his friend kidnap the Johnny Carson kind of star character who's played by Jerry Lewis. They hold him hostage. They negotiate a deal where he gets to host the show and to become a star. And he manages to do that. And he's a big hit, and he becomes a star, and he has his own TV show. And it's grotesque and horrifying, right? Because his fantasy narrative of himself turns out to be correct, right? But you sort of want to say it was a kind of grotesque coincidence, right? I mean, that's not the way the future is lived by us as we project into it, unless it's this kind of grotesque coincidence. That's an extreme case, and I'm using it just to make the point rather vividly that stories are retrospective, but you are in a position, interestingly, to tell the truth about somebody's life if you know them well enough that you share the futural perspective with them that is precisely what can't be put into a story. So as a biographer, and possibly as an artist painting a portrait, you face this dilemma, which is that to tell the story of their life, you in a sense have to alienate yourself from it in a certain way. And that's just a dilemma that's built into the genre. Okay, I'll stop there and talk. Thanks. Do we take questions, or what's the format? Do I call on people, or I can certainly, yeah. Martin first, I guess.
Yeah, this is not to steal the floor. It was just maybe it would be helpful for people if you say a little bit more just about the initial distinction Heidegger makes between unconcealment and correctness, those who haven't followed the seminar.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So that one also then sees the combination.
Okay.
Can you just explain that distinction?
Yes, okay, right. So, well, there's a lot to say about it. So the main point that Heidegger wants to make is that not so much that the traditional concept is wrong. In fact, he doesn't even really say the correspondence theory of truth is wrong. I think he thinks it's just kind of useless as a theory. It's a theory of correctness. But he's not interested in rejecting that concept of truth, but he wants to say it's only intelligible to us thanks to this other phenomenon which philosophers have missed, which is the showing up of things. And things show up, perception reveals a world, there's just a world that's always already there, about which a belief, a proposition, a sentence can be true or false, which you can have an accurate or an inaccurate view of. And Heidegger calls that condition of correctness truth. And he likes to use the Greek word, but what he means by it is unconcealment as opposed to concealment. I tried to say a little bit about how that works differently from you.
Like a simple example is like, the scientific paradigm is unconcealing because it allows things to show up as things that you can be right or wrong about, and it's that why it matters to be right or wrong about certain facts.
Yes.
So like
That's right.
You know,
Yeah.
Unconcealment is to establish a framework within which you can be wrong or right, and where you have a sense of why that matters. So like Newtonian science is unconcealing because it allows things to show up as effects of gravity, and you can be right and wrong about certain predictions within that, but that right
That's
and wrong
exactly
is not the same thing as a paradigm.
That's right. And other philosophers have talked about conceptual frameworks or languages, vocabularies. They're not correct or incorrect, but your having them shows things up about which you can have correct or incorrect opinions or beliefs or so on. Yeah. So, just a culture lets things show up differently, right? So, here's an example. I heard Bernard Williams talk about, how some words die out and are no longer part of our vocabulary because they don't reveal anything. Chastity used to be a very different kind of concept in the Middle Ages from what it is now. Now it's a kind of, in a way, trivial concept. You don't make much use of it because, what is it and who is chaste and who cares, right? But it used to be a virtue. There used to be a very thick moral kind of language about chastity. It wasn't just about whether or not you were having sex. It was a character quality that ramified. And when you don't have that term in your language but in your system of thought, you don't know how to apply it. And I think his idea was we would no longer know how to describe people as chaste or unchaste. We don't know how it ramifies into other aspects. Whereas the people who had that part of their thinking and part of their language knew how to apply it to people or not, and whether you were right or wrong in applying it, because it was showing things up in a way that allowed you to entertain those judgments. There's many examples from different philosophers. If you know Foucault, when Foucault talks about epistemes, you can think of those as revealing something within which people can disagree. It's very important for Foucault that the disagreements that are really the deepest disagreements people seem to have are possible only because they share something like an episteme. But when somebody in the Renaissance says that the number of heavenly bodies corresponds to the number of holes in the head, we don't even know whether to say that's false or true. You just can't even take it seriously, right? But that was a serious claim. It was thought to be some people might have said, no, that's false, but they could do so only because they were taking it seriously. So unconcealment is that kind of manifestation of something or other about which a belief could be true or false. Now, Heidegger was so interested in saying that the unconcealment is a condition of correctness, and it was an important point to make, that by 1964, he didn't seem to have too much invested in whether you call that by the same name as what it's the condition of. So Mark Rathall, whom I mentioned, just says, don't worry about whether you call it truth, and Heidegger seems to say this in 1964. What's important is that you can't have truth in the traditional sense without that unconcealment. Now, I think what he seemed to be surrendering there was this idea that the ordinary notion of rightness, which is the opposite of wrong and not the opposite of hidden, is a broader notion than factual accuracy. And it needs to encompass something that also coincides with a way of kind of revealing. So portraits can be revealing of the person. In photography, as much as painting, you think that picture really captures the person. And as we know, bad photograph snapshots with people's eyes half closed and their tongues hanging out, and that doesn't capture the person, even though there's a sense in which it being a photograph, it's almost by definition accurate, right? Brutally accurate. Now, these are all kinds of platitudes, but I think they're cases which maybe suggest that Heidegger should have tried a little bit more to say how these two concepts interact or overlap, so that we can think about, and this is what Raymond Goethe is thinking about in the case of his memoir, what it was to be true, to write truly of his father. And I'm suggesting it has something to do with fidelity to his father, being true to his father, and more specifically, knowing him well enough that he sees the world, as it were, through his father's eyes, so that he can appreciate the kind of future, which is precisely what resists being packaged in the form of a story or a narrative.
Thanks for calling on me. I'm going to miss what is going to, I'm sure, be a terrific discussion. Let me be the first to congratulate you. It's a really well-presented piece.
Thank you.
I want to bring in the issue of the fictional character, and I'll do it through just a quick reference to the person I read on these things, which is Paul Ricoeur, who writes about Heidegger a lot. In his essays on his books on storytelling, he wants to relate the storyteller, the fictional storyteller, to to the historian. They're both doing histoire.
Yeah.
Saying that the fictional storyteller knows when he gets something wrong about a character that he's inventing.
Interesting.
In the same way that a historian knows when he's going in the archive when something is pertinent or not impertinent. And so I wonder whether or not you seem to need a referent out there or want to have one that people could check on.
I see.
Whereas Ricoeur is going to say, in fact, the same thing applies. Somebody comes back from a day at the fiction writing office and says, I got it wrong today.
Yeah. No, that's fine with me. I don't mean to restrict it to that. And I'm sympathetic to the example. Yeah, I suppose you could, you can talk about, that's fine with me. I'm writing a novel and I'm, as Flaubert is writing about Madame Bovary and maybe at a certain point he gets it wrong about her. It's a different thing, of course. I do think that there are real important differences. I mean, it's a matter of coherence and consistency, but it's as if he knows her. That's okay. Let's see, what else do I want to say about that? The difference just is that whereas in the real case, there's loyalty, truth as fidelity to the person, but the realness of the person is also tied to there actually being facts about the person's life, which there won't be in the fictional case. That is an important difference. Now, I don't know what to say about the relation between what I'll call the factual accuracy and the fidelity. Can a biography or portrait be faithful without any regard to the facts? I don't think so. But yeah. Okay. No. Actually, good. Let me refer you to the portrait just quickly. So, Françoise Gillot, who, by the way, is still alive, lives in New York. She's in her 90s, and she talks about this painting in her memoir. Picasso was competing with Matisse here because Matisse had painted someone as a flower, and Picasso wanted to paint somebody as a flower, so he paints her. Now, I think it's Gombrich who refers to this picture and points out, interestingly, that, and the story that Gillot tells is that Picasso got it wrong over and over again, couldn't get it right. Now, of course, in the sense of loyalty or fidelity, because, how do you get it right if you make her a flower or not? But it didn't capture her. And it wasn't until he turned the face 90 degrees. So you'll notice she has a very vertically oval kind of face. And it wasn't until he turned it 90 degrees and made it horizontally oval that he got it. So the reason it's a nice example is because it's precisely by getting it wrong that he gets it right. Now, I think the other reason it's a useful example is because you could say, well, look, it looks like her because there's that spot under her left eye, and that's there. And there's the eyebrows look similar, and the nose has a similar shape. You can point to actual similarities and say, see, there's a factual accuracy there, which is really doing the work. But I don't think that's just what's doing the work. I think Gombrich is right that it's the horizontal positioning of the face that somehow captures the shape of her face and captures her expression and does it. So there's a kind of truth that I think is in its own way primitive and not reducible to accuracy. And the way I would want to sort of generalize that is to say I do think some resemblances are primitive. Wittgenstein has a nice example where he says, if I show you two pictures of trees, and I say, what do they have in common? You can point to the tree and say, there's a tree in that one, and there's a tree in that one. But if I show you two shades of red, and I can say, these are two shades of red, what do they have in common? That allows you to say they're two shades of red, you can't point to anything. It's just that, so I think some resemblances are like that. The one thing just looks like another, but you can't point to the thing in virtue of which the one resembles the other. And I think maybe this fidelity is a little like that. I don't want to reduce it to a notion of resemblance, but you have to be able to see in the biography, you have to recognize the person, right? You have to say, yes, that's him, you got it right. That really is who he was, or she, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see, maybe in the back there, yeah, and then I'll come back here for instance.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I really learned a lot. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about where religious truths fit into this picture, because one could argue. I mean, I'm not talking about religious truths like how many mouths correspond to how many stars, right? But like deep speculative truths like the incarnation, Christ,
Yeah.
the Annunciation, Trinity, and stuff like that. And one could say and argue that these things may not actually be factual or accurate, but they are right in being true to some form of like human life. I was wondering what are your thoughts on the issue?
That's fine with me, and I think it's why religious belief hasn't just evaporated once the factual truth of its doctrines seem to be no longer tenable. It's precisely because something else is going on. Like paradigms or vocabularies or frameworks, religious vocabularies or religious belief systems can make things show up. A good example of this in sort of modern half-religious, half-secular society is Dostoevsky when he talks about Father Zosima. There you get an interesting conflict between the way religious belief and scientific beliefs are competing for showing up the way the world is. So when I was talking about a chaste person, what about a saint? Can somebody be a saint? What would it be for somebody to be a saint? Dostoevsky, I think, was very interested in that. What would that look like? Or does our scientific and secular vocabulary make sainthood a totally outmoded concept? Zosima was supposedly healing people, but then it turned out he was giving them drugs. So does that just undermine your faith in him altogether? It's a problem. So I think that's one way to understand a kind of truth in religious belief, is that it's even though possibly factually inaccurate and just false, it allows you to see things you couldn't see before. A religious vocabulary might attune you to human suffering and promote compassion in a way that you can't do if you're just thinking in terms of medicine or mental illness. By the way, another example from Raymond Gaeta's book is that his father, after his mother's suicide, had a kind of mental breakdown and was in a kind of institute. And he went to see his father, when Raymond Gaeta, was 15. And he said it was a watershed point in his life because it was a kind of traumatic adjustment from the sort of vocabulary in which he understood his father's life, which was through the lens of philosophy and tragedy. And now, in terms of psychological diagnoses and medicine and nurses and doctors, there's a whole different set of categories that seemed to not do justice to who his father was. It was a kind of violence to the sense that he had of his father's life, which he tried to preserve in his book, that his father had this kind of tragic life, a view of life. He describes his father's view of the world in terms of what he calls compassionate fatalism. He was deeply compassionate, but he was also fatalistic. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but it was a tragic view of life that Raymond Gaeta understood, that the medical sort of vocabulary of the asylum just was incapable of comprehending. So I'm all for that, but let me say, I'm all for it, but I'm also all for metaphors being true in this sense, right? Metaphors are another good general example of how you can get it right by, not just in spite of getting it wrong, but like the picture, you get it right by getting it wrong. I think that's fine, because it's revealing. What metaphors do is reveal. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, what I was going to say to that was that what motivated the question was Hegel's position, right, where Christianity or like certain speculative truths can coincide with conceptual truths and live on the same level, even though they may be expressed in different form. And whether a philosopher who had a certain notion of the truth that unrevealing may be okay with sharing the same space as maybe someone who is deeply embedded in a certain kind of foreshadowing that isn't conceptual.
I see.
In that sense, the philosopher has no privileged access to conceptual truth because they're both expressing on equal levels a reality in an unvarnished form, despite the fact that they may be on a different level or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, Hegel was, as we know, notoriously optimistic about the idea that reason could then sort of, recover and recapture these truths at a higher level of articulation, and that there would be all this consistency and so on. I'm much more of I won't say I'm a pessimist, but I'm more impressed by the incommensurabilities between these different ways of understanding, and that there are metaphors, religious beliefs, stories that are never going to be comprehended entirely, just as Gaeta says, just by reason or science, and that these will never be all harmonized. But that's just my own perspective. Let's see, here you had.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned Oedipus, and I think there's another angle that helps the case, as it were, and that is Tiresias. Very quickly, almost in the first scene, identifies Oedipus as the murderer. You are the murder. You are the pollution.
Yeah.
And it's not illuminating. It doesn't reveal anything to anybody.
Oh, yeah.
Even though he's speaking the precise truth.
Accurate, but not. Yeah, I didn't say this at all, but that's right. It should be obvious that there's all kinds of factual truths that are totally unilluminating. And this is a kind of platitude, too. Like, there's all kinds of true facts that are just not interesting. They don't answer a question. I mean, there are some historians at the very positivist end of the discipline of history who have said, quite seriously, any fact you can add to the historical record is a contribution to the study of history. Like, how many stones are there in this road from one city to another? You've made a contribution, but it's a pretty absurd view. So yeah, how many blades of grass are there in the lawn over there in the square? Who cares? There's all and as we know, you can mislead people by sticking to the facts in one particular way. So it just seems to me absolutely vital that we think of truth as involving an aspect of revealing. That's why I'm always so disappointed that Heidegger didn't say more about how rightness itself is right by revealing, and not just that the one kind of category is, call it truth or not, is a condition of the other. It's just like an unfulfilled promise, I think, in what he says about it. Let's see now. Oh, so many hands. Please, yes, please, yeah.
It seems to me that Tiresias' circumstance is a very, very different one that you just described. It's neither equivalent to how many stones are there in this road.
No.
Nor is it simply unrevealing. It is rather about the social nature of truth and whether to whom is it revealing. It's revealing to him. It's just that nobody else understands.
It's revealing to the audience, I guess, too, isn't it? Or I guess we know that
in performance, revealing to the audience as
well.
And,
I'm sorry. Yeah. No, you're right. Did I miss your point, though? I mean.
It's knowledge he already had. The audience already has the knowledge as well. So in this sense, it doesn't.
Well, maybe you could say this.
But the others on stage don't have that.
Yeah. I mean, what it does is reveals Oedipus's ignorance. I mean, I guess you could say that, right? I mean, it really underlines his blindness. I'm not sure what to say about that. I thought your point just was truth in the sense of correctness needn't be revealing, which I agree with. But
also, you were talking about how there has to be turns in a life before you can actually understand. So that's what I'm saying. It was too soon. It wasn't.
Before there can be a story, I don't think there have to be turns in a life in order for it to be understood in any way. Let me be clear about that. I don't think lives have to enact structure of a story in order to be understood. I think we can understand a life without recurring to narrative form. I think it'll be virtually impossible, because by the time you get to any kind of complexity and a life unfolds, there will be occasions for these stories to happen. And it's almost, so I just think as a practical matter, there are stories all over the place to tell about just what happened to me today. And I can tell you, and the Barbara Hardy quote that I said, we do all these things and daydream and gossip and love and hate. She's right about gossiping, right? I mean, gossiping is trading stories, telling stories. That's fairly loving and hating. I don't know that we love and hate in story form. So I don't want to say that lives have to do that. I think they inevitably will, just because with enough events happening and as things change, perspective changes enough retrospectively that it's a very natural and almost unavoidable way to talk about each other and to each other in story form. So it's all over the place. It's just not, as it were, ontologically essential, I think. And it's particularly in relation to the future. It's just not the structure of our relation to our future. That's, I guess, what I want to say. Yeah. Okay. Wow. I don't know. Maybe in the way back.
Okay. Thanks for the talk, and it's very crystal clear. And I have a question, actually tying back to this last question. It's about, because what you've been talking about is mainly about knowing others, telling story about self-understanding. Because self-understanding can be very different from understanding others.
That's for sure.
Merleau-Ponty we're aware of. And as to my knowledge, philosophers nowadays who argues against narrativity, like for instance, Galen Strawson then Zahawi, they argue against a view of narrative as a model to understand self instead of as a model to understand in the arts. So I want to know what's your view on that?
Yes, okay, so I'm in between them and the narrativists, I think, in a certain way, because Galen Strawson's idea, I think, really is that there isn't necessarily an answer to the question, who was this person? I think what's moving about Goethe's discussion of his own memoir about his father is that he thinks there's a question to ask and an answer to be given. Now, what I meant to say was there's not just one answer to give, because only he could have given the answer he gave when he wrote the book about his father. Somebody else would have told a different story and said something different. So it's the knowledge we have of people knowing who they are will be perspectival. And it'll be essentially perspectival in the sense that there will be multiple and probably competing and conflicting stories, and no one of which can claim uniquely to be the truth. But what I like about Goethe's view, and this is different from what Strawson says, I do think that it's a meaningful question to ask and to try to give an answer to, that you can say who somebody is. You can say it by knowing them, only by really knowing them. When you know them, you know who they are, and you can say something about who they are. And there is something to get right or not get right, but it's not a matter of just the facts. Now, the other thing I want to say, though, is that, as you say, the structure of our relation to ourselves is different to our relation to others. So I also have a relation to the question about myself, who am I? And going back to those of you who are in the Heidegger class, that's a question from the first person point of view, which has a different structure, I think a crucially non-narrative structure. Who I am is what's at stake in how I'm living my life, how I'm projecting into my future. But I have to project into my future to be dealing with the question, who I am, and there's a sense in which it's always a kind of open-ended question. But that's the same question. This is something, again, Heidegger doesn't really talk about much. That I'm asking the same question of myself that somebody else would ask when they say, who was he really? Right? So I do think the structural difference between the first and second person is important. Yeah. Yeah.
You just said something which confuses me a great deal.
Uh-oh.
From the moment you began to talk about narrative, it seemed to me I would be utterly convinced if this were a lecture on Augustine rather than Heidegger. I kept on wondering what it had to do with, what the narrative had to do with time and science.
Oh.
But now, when you say that a self-examination cannot be narrative, I wonder where the Confessions and the entire autobiographical tradition goes.
Oh, I only meant to say with respect to the future I'm projecting into. Of course I can take up a narrative point of view to my life up to the present, of course. Yeah, no, I don't mean to be denying that at all. No, probably not. But not because lives just are intrinsically narrative in their structure, but just because, given the unfolding of a life over time, it'll be virtually impossible for there not to be stories. And that story is a genre or a form in which we make sense of ourselves. I only want to deny it this sort of bedrock metaphysical status. I want to say that it's typically one of the basic ways in which we make sense of ourselves. But it has this retrospective structure which keeps it from being our way of relating to our future, except in this like King of Comedy way where we tell ourselves a story and maybe it'll turn out to be accurate and maybe it won't be, but it'll be a matter of luck whether it does or not. I would say for Heidegger's purposes, there's probably going to be something just inauthentic about trying to live your life into the future by already having the story that you're planning to tell retrospectively by the end of it. You're not in a position to narrate the story of your life into the future. But of course I agree that up to the present moment, it's a very natural thing to do, to say, here's the story of my life. It's something I want to think about a lot more. I think autobiography is a very strange genre. It puts you in a very awkward position, being both the narrator and the liver of the life that you're talking about. There's a tension there, I think. But sure, of course, with respect to the past, absolutely. I will again say, there's not going to be just one story. There's going to be a multiplicity of stories. There's going to be a multiplicity of stories from different perspectives. What it is to be true to your own story, I don't know what to say about it. It's so hopelessly complicated. Fidelity to your own story, it may just be that there's something almost impossible about that. But I don't quite know what to say about autobiography. Okay, one more. It's not surprising that it's just about the most difficult genre to write in, right? Write an autobiography. It's a huge challenge. It might seem like the easiest thing to do. It's probably the hardest. One more question. Does somebody feel like they had their hand up a long time and I missed them? Just if you want to make a special case. How about you?
So my question is, in measuring the truthfulness of the third type of knowledge that you mentioned, namely knowledge by knowing someone, to what extent do you think the understanding of the person being portrayed plays a role? For example, in the case of Goethe that you mentioned, Goethe feels fidel towards his father, but the person towards whom he is fidel may not be the same in which his father perceived himself.
Oh, yeah.
Right, so, because I'm thinking of the numerous instances in which the feeling of fidelity or love can be directed towards someone, which remains an image rather than the real person, or the way that the person perceived him or herself. So do you think the self-understanding of the subject being portrayed matters at all?
That was sort of my main thesis, really. It absolutely matters. Which doesn't mean that the narrator has to agree with everything, but there has to be a commonality of view enough that that the narrator somehow can partially inhabit the view that the person had of himself. That's what I meant to be saying, that's essential. This is why it's very difficult sometimes for biographers when they get to know their subjects too well. They might feel like now they're no longer in the ideal position to write the biography. They don't have enough distance. They're too close to the person, right? So being too close to the person, precisely because you share their view of themselves, may keep you from knowing how to tell the story anymore. But what I wanted to say was his love for his father is what was allowing him to be truthful about his father. It was making it difficult in some ways, but it was the condition. So Goethe is very sensitive. As he says, he wants to tell it like it is. He wants to try to tell it truly, with a true feeling, to see things as they are, not as they kept appearing to me. So there's a very important distinction between appearance and reality. I should have said this a long time ago. What allows us to say that there's an issue of rightness in the telling of the story is that you feel that you are susceptible to mistaking appearance for reality. So just as you say, a mere image is going to be not good enough. But now, that distinction, as it were, between appearance and reality should not be understood in the sense that the reality is the soul of the person, which is a private, intrinsic feature of the person, not in relation to me. I think what we can be right about behind appearances is constituted by the relation to the second person. So we shouldn't let the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong, or seeing how it really is as opposed to appearances, lead us into thinking that we're getting behind a veil of appearance to an intrinsic reality, which just is what it is independently of its relation to me, the narrator. I think it's because he is his son and he loved his father that he can tell the story as it is and not just as it appeared to him. So it's absolutely essential, yeah. Somebody once said, I don't know who said this, somebody said it to me, could be nobody important, that you can only really take a good photograph of somebody if you love them. Now that may be sentimental, but there's something not completely wrong about it. It's like you've got the relation to the person there's an intimacy that allows you to capture them that you don't have if you're a stranger to the person. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.